All right, we are live. Tonight we are joined by Ed Monk of Last Resort Firearms Training. We're going to be talking about his active shooter response course. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual co-hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Firearms Radio Network and or their employers. Viewer discretion is advised. This is especially true on live shows. If you like what we're doing and would like to help support the show, visit patreon.com/afteractionproject. If you'd like to throw us some free support and appreciation, we would greatly appreciate a 5-star review anywhere that you're listening to this podcast, iTunes, Spotify, any of all of that good stuff. Tonight's episode, just like every episode, is brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network. Be sure to check out the other great podcast on the Firearms Radio Network by visiting firearmsradio.tv. All right, let's get into it, guys. Welcome back, everybody. If you missed us last week, we missed you last week as well because we were not here last week. Andy, talk to us a little bit about what you've been up to, man. I know you're up there in a different part of the state, enjoying some time with the family and doing some ice fishing. But what else have you been up to, man?
Yeah, right now, that's why I kind of have a weird background. I am up here in a cabin. It's supposed to be a whole 1 degree tonight, which is going to be interesting. But we had a good time. Caught a lot of fish. Caught 12 big 20-inch trout today, which was cool. As far as that, just work pretty much. The last time I was out shooting, a couple training just by myself. And then prior to that, went to the Quest 2022, which we talked about with Brian Hill, Tim Herron, and Scott Jedlinski, which was kind of cool. Learned a lot there, but that's pretty much it, man. Just working, enjoying the new grandbaby.
Nice. Yeah, congratulations. You got a new grandbaby. I got a new daughter. I don't know if we've been on since she's joined us. I'm getting plenty of sleep. My wife, not so much, on the other hand. I want to kick it over to our returning guest, Jeff, and then we'll have Jeremy introduce himself to our listeners, and then we will kick it over to Ed, who's everybody joining to see and learn about. But Jeff, what have you been up to, man, in the past couple weeks since we've last had you on? And tell our guests a little. And tell our guests a little bit about yourself, your training background, and what you do.
Yeah, Jeff Bourne. I've got a little company, Bourne Training Solutions, full-time job. I work for a school district, director of safety, training armed staff program there. Been doing a lot of training last few weeks. Recently got on with Patriot Training Center just outside of Talladega. Scheduled out to do some 2-day defensive pistol courses for them once a month. Going to pick up some rifle and shotgun down there as well later on as things progress. So, yeah, just a lot of training, a lot of working.
Nice. Jeremy, first time joining us. Glad to have you on the show with us tonight. Introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us a little bit about your training background and what brought you to Ed's active shooter response course.
Okay, so Jeremy Reese, principal at a high school, and kind of my background with firearms is been off and on shooting the last 5-6 years, and just as kind of like with everybody else, just the way the climate and the culture of things are going, just kind of want to be prepared just in case anything. And just kind of what brought me to Ed was through Jeff, working with him. And as he talked about, just a kind of a program that we've been working on just from an active shooter and safety standpoint, and had the opportunity to train under Ed in one of his courses, and just had a great time, learned a lot of stuff in the 2 days that was able to train with him.
Ed, we're going to be talking about the active shooter response course. Introduce yourself to our listeners. Your firearms training company is Last Resort Firearms Training, but you seem to be doing more active shooter response training than any other national level instructor that I'm aware of, and I'd imagine it's safe to assume that you're probably doing it more than any other instructor in the country at the moment. So, talk to us a little bit about what brought you to that niche and some of the challenges that you faced going into it.
Sure. I got into defensive gun training back probably around 1999, got into law enforcement in 2008. I started teaching high school after I retired from the military. And so I was a 42-year-old retired colonel, but I was a brand new snot-nosed rookie teacher. So as the new kid on the block, you shut up and you listen, you do what you're told as a brand new teacher. And I was in a very good school, one of the best in the state I was teaching in. And what I was told as the authority figure, as the teacher, as the staff member, was if they announced an active shooter, or if I could hear or see an active shooter and I knew there was one in the building, my job as the leader of the kids, as the authority figure, is to keep them in the room and pack them in the corner of the room as tight as I could and hold them there to see who would show up first, the cops or the killer. And again, I'm the new guy. I don't want to make waves. I don't want to start suggesting that things are wrong, especially things they've been doing for decades. But I thought to myself, other than pulling out my own pistol and shooting my own kids, I don't know how I could make the active shooter's job easier than to pack them all in the corner of my room. So a lot of times you think something, your gut tells you something is wrong, but you later find out it's because you don't really understand the problem. You don't really understand all the restrictions and parameters. So I said, okay, maybe I just don't understand this. It seems absolutely ludicrous, but maybe I don't understand. So that is the motivation that got me into looking into this. So I started studying it, trying to understand it. Then when I thought I had a good grip on it, at least the basics, I started providing training. And in the early years, that was just presentations, small 30-minute, hour presentations to schools, churches, other groups about it. And then I started giving live fire training, because when I went into this trying to learn about it myself, simply for a personal reason, I sought out training, and everything I went to, most everything I went to, whether it was inside law enforcement or in the civilian market, that was labeled as active shooter training, I didn't see much value in. The gun classes I went to that were labeled as active shooter seemed to be, okay, sit in a classroom, we're going to talk a little about Columbine, talk a little about Virginia Tech, now let's go shoot some paper targets. But not really do anything on the range different than a regular gun class. It's just that we talked about a few active shooters beforehand to give it a flavor, and then we went and shot. And I didn't think they were connecting the dots in developing specific training to fight this specific threat. And so I started developing my own active shooter training, the live fire portion of it beyond that. So that's what I've been doing since about 2012. I do 1, 2, and 3 day, because of course when I started out it was a 1-day class, and then I made a 2-day class, and now I have a 3-day class. And then in 2018 I started doing an active shooter instructor class, a 2-day active shooter instructor class. So that's what's got me into it. And so I will help schools, churches, law enforcement agencies, businesses, government, other government offices, anybody basically that wants to learn more about it and wants to get their response plan better, get the training for their people better. I will help them out. And as we discussed, since Uvalde, it's been absolutely crazy. And I was just December and January, I was up in Iowa. And of course, there was just a school shooting there. It wasn't an active shooter, but it was a school shooting. So I'm sure that will generate calls to get me back up there here pretty soon.
You mentioned... tell us, sorry about that, Jeremy. Break it down a little bit more for us on your classes as far as the 1, 2, and 3 day. What do you get, kind of quickly, what do you get between those 3 different courses and the instructor, I guess?
So I developed this using training development that I learned over 24 years in the Army. So you look at a threat and you study a threat, a specific threat, if you're going to train for that threat. So you look at a threat, you study it, and you try to define it. What are its weapon systems? What are its tactics, techniques, and procedures? How is it most likely to act when we encounter it? What are its weaknesses? What are its strengths? And then once you think you understand the threat you're going up against, then you define the environment in which you expect to fight that threat, because that's important too. And that's the fight, the threat and the environment. And then you develop the best operational fighting plan to defeat that enemy in the least amount of time with the fewest amount of friendly casualties. And then step 3 is you develop the best training plan you can to execute the fighting plan that you just came up with to defeat the enemy that you just defined. So first off, you have to understand the threat. So no matter if it's a 1, 2, or 3 day, you're going to get a block on the active shooter, on what's most likely to happen, who you're most likely to face, how they're most likely to act, what they're most likely to be armed with, and a little bit about what the fight will be like, the distances, crowded public place, etc. How long that is depends on whether it's a 1, 2, or 3 day. Then we look at the skills. If you have to make a priority list of the most important skills for this particular threat. And a priority list can't be 30 things. That's not a priority list. That's just a list. So the most important skills, I think, to fight this threat in the environment we're most likely. The first one is not really an active shooter skill. The first skill is you have to be at a certain basic level of safety and ability to operate and run your gun. That's not an active shooter specific thing. That's more of it. You have to be at least this tall to ride this ride. Because as the people that have been through the training, like Jeff and Jeremy, because once you start, it starts getting more complicated and more difficult. And if you're unsafe or very low skilled, neither one of those things is going to get better as we start putting more stress on you, getting you further from the target and doing the other things. So we do a quick assessment in the beginning just to make sure. If it's a returning group that I've had before, then that's going to be a very short thing. But if it's a church group that I've never worked with before, that's going to be a longer thing. Then what I think is the absolute most important part of the shooting of this is everybody leaves understanding how far back from the target can they get 100% hits. Not most hits, not almost all hits, but 100% hits. And what that's going to translate into is, okay, once I go and find this threat, this active shooter in this environment, how close do I have to get to him in order to ensure that I'm within my skill level distance to get 100% hits on this guy? And when I say hits, I'm talking about center line, solid hits that hollow points would stay in the body. So we want hits for two reasons. One, it hurts and debilitates them, but two, with good handgun hollow point ammo, hopefully the people behind him are at very minimal risk. That's the most important thing. So on a 1 day, that's probably all we're going to get to on the range. Before we may or may not go, depending on the skill level of the group, to the last part, which is the scenarios. Then if we have a 2 or 3 day, the next thing we'll go to is shooting on the move, or actually hitting on the move. Anybody can shoot on the move. What we'd like to do is hit on the move with our handguns. Most students are quite surprised at how well they can do that. The problem is it takes time, limited time in a class, but it takes time to teach that and let the student work through that and figure out what they need to do to actually get pretty decent at that. That's not a requirement. Anytime you encounter an active shooter, you can plant your feet and shoot him flat-footed. There's nothing wrong with that. But being able to shoot on the move has its advantages, especially if you encounter him during a fast search. Now, what's in the 3 day that's not in the 2 day is building search. Both we teach a fast and a slow search. I don't think that's critical. I've gotten a lot of criticism from other instructors. You have to have building search in an active shooter class. But then I show them a list of 20 armed people, cops and citizens, who stopped an active shooter without using any kind of building clearing skills, but they still pound the desk and say, no, you have to have it. I don't put it as high as being able to hit on the move or my number one, which is knowing how far back you can get 100% hits. And then what I think and what all my students say is the best part of the training, the most rewarding part of the training is the scenarios. So what we want to do is put the student in as realistic scenario that mimics is going to be like what he's going to be in if he has to go up against an active shooter, right? If cops were going to train their officers on how to respond to a surprise shootout during a traffic stop, they would have a suspect car, so many people in the car, and it would go, they would pile out of the car and they would mimic it. They would make it look like that. So I try to do our scenarios that look like an active shooter, which is several people, one of which has a gun. Go in there, find the one that's the problem, get within your skill level, depending on what that is, and then put 100% of your shots in the center line of that torso until you shoot them to the ground. Once you shoot them to the ground, I call that round. That's round one of the fight, but there could be round 2, round 3. That's up to the active shooter. Putting him on the ground is the end of round 1. And so in the training, in the classroom portion, I go over active shooter attacks where they were shot to the ground, but then either kept shooting from the ground or they got back up. So I stress that just because you shoot them to the ground doesn't mean it's time to give high fives and holster your gun. and that the fight's over. So I can do it in several different ways. The best way is with 3D mannequin torsos that I set up on top of the 50-gallon plastic barrels. You could also use milk crates or any other certain things. And the way I tape them up and the way I set them up there, it's not perfect, but 90 to 95% of the time, if they get somewhere between 2 and 5 pistol hits, they'll fall to the ground. And that's the most realistic way I have so far of doing that. I can also do it with photographic targets. It's better than just shooting, bullseyes or paper silhouettes. But from what I can tell and from my students, it's not nearly as good as the 3D scenarios. Because what I found is when you take the student from shooting the paper targets, the fade back drill, the shooting on the move, all this stuff on the regular paper targets, once you jump to the scenarios, it is a huge mental leap for the student. Huge. So because of that, my scenarios start out very simple. Probably only 2 or 3 people in the room, wherever they're going to go into to find the scenario. It's going to be fairly close. There's not going to be a lot of clutter. There's not going to be a lot of noise. There's not going to be a lot of distractions. All I want to see on that first scenario is, can the student demonstrate the skills they showed me on paper targets before this here in this scenario where they have a lot more unknowns? Can they simply find the bad guy and apply the pistol skills they already proved they could do in here? And can they keep a cool head and shoot logically instead of emotionally? As long as they're successful, every scenario after that is going to be a little more complex. What I say is it's always the same, just different. It's always going to be one bad guy with a gun in there shooting good people. It just gets more complicated. The bad guy will be further away. It'll be harder to see the gun. There'll be good people in front of him, good people behind him, victims on the ground, furniture on the ground, fire alarms going off, people screaming, gunshots, strobe lights. Every time they're successful, we'll make it just a little more complicated the next time. So the number of individual scenario runs is going to vary. On a 1 day with a fairly advanced class, they might get 1, 2, or 3. On a 2 day, we might get 3, 4, or 5. On a 3 day, we could probably get a few more.
Man, there's a lot to dive into and unpack there. Before we do that, though, I want to kick it over to Jeremy and talk a little bit about what Jeremy, was it the 1, 2, or 3 day class that you attended?
The 2 day.
The 2 day class. What is the first part of that day one, without giving out, the secret sauce or anything, but what does the first part of day one look like outside of the classroom?
Well, it's kind of like what Ed was saying. You start out just kind of your normal shooting paper targets, just kind of trying to zero in, and then as it progressed, and that was the one thing that I really loved about the class was just how it progressed to the end result. So Ed knows what he wants his students to be able to do at the end, but and to the end, you really don't see how everything was tied together. And that was the neat thing for me to see that progression of still shooting, multiple shots, those types of things, then progressing to movement, and then as he was talking about coming back to finding your distance where you were 100% accurate, and then progressing then to the scenarios, to where you then had to, be able to focus and dive into everything, look at, where's your target, where's your bad guy, and then look at, where's your bystanders, what other things are in the way, then to be able to ultimately take out the bad guy.
Nice. What was your 100% distance, Jeremy, if you don't mind me asking?
12 yards.
And was that surprising for you, or were you kind of, did that kind of fall in where you were expecting it to land?
Yeah, I think that's about where I kind of felt comfortable, consistently, and then especially with moving, and that was, one of the things, the hardest thing for me that, when we went into the scenarios was I see a bad guy and trying to, play that situation realistically in my setting, or, when children are involved or anybody else, somebody that I love, I want to take that target out as soon as possible. And so once you realize where that target was, but then being able to close that distance and not shoot too soon. And then that's where you take in the off shots and the bystanders and those types of things that, we want to, as Ed was talking about, that 100% hits accuracy, more so than anything else.
In the intro, you mentioned that you were a principal at a high school. And that was a bit surprising for me. Because that's not something that I would have I guess this isn't a class that I would expect a principal of a high school to take in this day and age. And without getting into politics or anything like that, what the heck brought you? Where is this? Do you have a background in firearms that this is kind of something that you would have taken if you weren't a principal? Did you feel like you had a sense of duty to go out and seek this training out? And are you able? I don't know if I want to ask that question, but yeah, what the heck brought you to that class? Like, why is that? For me, it's a little bit dumbfounding to me because that's normally not what we hear, right? Normally we hear, hey, keep all of this kind of stuff out of the schools. We're just going to run, hide, and fight. Emphasis on hiding, right? And is this something that are you a one-off in your school district, I guess?
Well, a lot of it is, just for my own personal knowledge, to better myself personally, and yes, I am a part of a school. So, a lot of the active response stuff and the active shooter response stuff now is the schools, in which, a lot of just, when I had the opportunity to train there with Ed, I jumped on it just for my own personal knowledge and betterment. So, at the end of the day, I want to come home. I got a family and kids, and so anything that I can do to better my skill set to be able to come home at the end of the day, that's what I wanted to do.
Love it.
Very good.
Hey, Jeff.
Go
ahead, Andy.
Hey, Jeff, so I want to test you on this course, and then if you don't have the answer, of course, we'll have Ed come in. So I want to know a little bit more about this 100% accuracy shooting at distance. Is there a course of fire is it 10 rounds? How far distance, or is it one round and you keep backing up until you find where you're not accurate? What's the detail on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I did it with Ed. It's been a while now, and immediately was taking it with several other instructors, and we're like, why have we not been doing this in any firearms class already? So I've stole that from Ed. I do it in everything I do now. But what you do, I believe we start at 5 yards. You got to get 10 hits. Those hits are not a consecutive string of fire. So Ed, as the instructor or whoever's running that drill, will say 2. You fire 2 shots, then it might be 1, then it might be 3 to progress up to 10 shots in that string. If you have all your hits inside the 8-inch circle, you move back to the next distance. 7 yards, 10 yards, 12, 15, 17, 20, 22. That's where I tapped out, I think. And you can go back as far as you need to go. But we also, I know Ed does this, and I stole it from him also. You can keep going, and get that work in, but you remember where that max distance is. Then the glorious part of it is not only do you learn that max distance, but you go verify that with your carry ammo, because how many people do that? We might shoot 115 grain junk out on the range, then we throw 124 grain HHT in there, and you get a discrepancy in your point of impact. So it's a fantastic drill, and just glad I got to see it firsthand and do it, because the value of that drill is fantastic. And then, of course, like Jeremy was talking about, you go test yourself on that in the scenarios, and I don't want to take Ed's stuff away from him here, but we're gonna throw a beanbag down where you throw that first shot, and we're gonna see where that fell within your range. Did you shoot too soon? Did you wait too long? Because I have obviously not done this as much as Ed, but helping him and getting to run the photorealistic targets that day, I thought I would see people shooting from too far out. So Ed, tell me, I saw people waiting too long that day. Which is more common, do you see?
By far, shooting from too far back. And that's usually in the first 1 or 2 runs when they get real emotional, and then they usually wheel it in after them. But yeah, it's almost 90% as they shoot further back than their skill allows for.
I figured I had a little anomaly going on. I had a little bit of waiting too long going on that day, but yeah, that definitely makes sense. So yeah, it's a fantastic drill, fade-back drill, great drill.
Ed, what's the average distance that you see, when you're in a church group, or somebody that doesn't have the firearms background, or the firearms training background as like Jeff does, an instructor? What's the average distance that these guys are typically pushing out to?
Sometimes church groups can have a huge variety of skill level and gear when they show up. So they could have people that can't get hits past 7, and in the same group have a guy that can get hits back to 18. But if it's a kind of a lower forming group, then almost all of them will miss, if not the 7 at the 10. So I tell them, okay, today, your current skill with the gun you chose to train with. So if you're happy with that, then continue to train to solidify that and make that very consistent under stress. If you're not happy with it, then there are training things we can do to get you further back, and there might be gun things, swap guns, swap sights. There might be. If you're happy with it, rock on and make it rock solid. If you're not happy with it, there are probably things we can do, especially if you're a weaker shooter and you start missing at the 7 or the 10. Now, if you're getting hits back to the 30, there's probably not a whole lot we can do to extend you from there. But for the weaker ones, you can. And I've had people say, well, what's your distance you have to be able to shoot to pass your class? And I'm like, there is no test. I want people to know their distance. So if I'm rather weak, I'm safe with my gun, but I'm rather weak, and I really can't get consistent hits past the 7, but Jeff's getting them at the 22. That just means if I'm the one trying to hunt down the active shooter and I find him, I've got to get within 7 yards. Jeff only has to get within 20. So it's not a, I shot better than you competition thing. It's I just got to know my limitations. The person who's there and who's willing to fight, even if they're lower skilled, is a lot better than the most tactically proficient John Wick in the world who's 5 minutes away.
Do you see a specific level of diminishing skill from the once they know their distance to now you put them in the scenario, right? Jeff can 100% at 22, but I put him in a scenario and now his distance is 17 yards or 15 yards. Do you see a decline in ability once you throw him into the scenario?
Not everybody, but a lot. And it's usually to emotional shooting. So when they come in and shoot, as Jeff said, we'll drop the beanbag at wherever they took their first shot. We'll play all the way through the after action drills, then we'll end it. Eventually we'll ask them, what was your brain struggling with when you came in here? What were you smelling, seeing, hearing, shooting? What were you struggling with? How hard was it to find him? Once you found him, what did you do? We also have somebody counting rounds. So then when all that's over, we'll pull the mannequin up and pull the shirt up. And so how many rounds did he fire? 7. I have 3 hits, 1 of them a good hit, 2 of them not good hits. Where are those other 4? Well, so there's 2 different, there's yesterday or this morning, you proved to yourself and us, you got no business shooting in a public pace past 10 yards. How far back did he fire his first round? 26 yards. Well, we know the problem, right? And I talk them through this. Very unlikely the active shooter is going to pull his gun right out in front of you. Now, that happened in White Settlement, but that's extremely rare. So probably you're going to hear the popping, hear the shooting, hear the screaming, and you're going to have to go find this guy. So you already are feeling the stress of, I'm behind the power curve. I'm behind time. He needed to be shot 15 seconds ago before I find him. So I'm already late. So understand you're going to feel that stress, but you got to control it. Get in there and find him, and then just don't, I found him. Well, okay, I found him, but are you within your distance? If you are, then apply your skills. If not, get within your distance and apply. So that's one. The other one is, you mark it off. How far away were you in this scenario? 12 yards when you started shooting. Well, yesterday you proved you could get 100% shots back to 15. So you were within your skill level. You just didn't apply your skill. And usually they'll admit it. They'll say, "Oh yeah, first I don't even know if I saw my sights the first time. I was just in a hurry. I just wanted to get the gun up there and shoot." Or once I started getting my first couple of hits, I got overconfident, and then I started shooting too fast, and so I know I threw my last couple. So many times they'll know what they did wrong. But that's all. Okay, so what are you going to do next time? Well, I'm just going to shoot a little slower, because 4 really good solid hits beats 1 good hit, 2 bad hits, and 4 misses in the same amount of time. Slow down and get hits. You can't miss fast enough to win this thing. So it's just about them fighting through the frustration of, I can't find him. I know he's in here. I can't find him, until they find him. And then once they find him, having the tactical patience to hit those hydraulic brakes and slow down enough to get their hits. And so in later scenarios, there won't be in the first scenario, or probably the second, but in later scenarios down the road, they're going to have friendlies in front and friendlies in back of the threat target. So they're going to have to make a decision of, A, do I change my angle? Or B, if the friendlies are behind, do I have absolute confidence in a center line hit? So even though there's a threat, not a friendly behind him, and there is some risk there, but if I've got 100% confidence in my ability to hit, then I'm going to put that person at small risk in order to stop this mass killing in the quickest amount of time.
Jeff, as an instructor, participating in this class as a student, what was one of the things that surprised you, or that you were most impressed with, about the level of instruction that the students were receiving?
Well, I think it identifies a lot of things that a typical shooting class does not. Like Ed alluded to, emotional shooting earlier. I know when I took Ed's instructor course, I fell victim to that in the photorealistic targets, and I believe my second run, as I get in there and I'm trying to do this real fast and find this guy and take him out, I shoot a very nice, very small group that would have tore the center out of the 8-inch ring on a Rangemaster Q target. The only problem was he was bladed, and I shot the back of his jacket because I had a training scar, and I identified that immediately, that, take your time, slow down, see your target, verify it, make the hits you need, or that was just a wasted effort, pretty much. So I think things like that it brings out, and fade-back drill. And you have to think with the gun, right? So learning to think with the gun, I think this course really brings that out in you, especially when you get into those scenarios. And I think that's probably the most beneficial aspect of it.
Jeremy, what was the most challenging part of the class for you?
For me, was definitely the scenarios, and really because it was the first time that I had ever been put in that situation, and shooting at paper and stationary all day long. I felt 100% accurate and 100% confident. But when you start bringing in other things, start bringing in those scenarios, and then looking at, okay, who's behind the target, who's in front, the sound, the noise, and as I said, just wanting to put the target down as soon as possible, but having to realize a couple of times, slow down, you're not in range yet, and just kind of being able to put all of that together, was probably the hardest part for me. But again, the most rewarding, because now, when I go to practice at home, I go practice on my range, I know some of these, different scenarios to put myself into, with movement and knowing, just to kind of better myself.
Ed, what's the round count on your courses each day?
It kind of depends on what group I have. The 2-day is 400 rounds, but the students have some leeway in how many drills they shoot in a course. As we have explained, the more skilled you are, the more you're going to shoot. Because if you miss at the 7-yard line, what I tell them is, you're welcome to keep shooting if you want to, but you don't have to. But if you're a really good, you're going to shoot at the 7, the 10, the 12.5, the 15, the 17.5, and that's 10 rounds each time. So the higher skilled shooter in the class may shoot 100 more rounds than the lower skilled student, just because of that. And then it depends on the scenarios you run. If you'll shoot fewer rounds, because if you get in there and give me 2 or 3 or 4 good solid center body hits, that'll end the scenario, versus a mag dump because you're not getting the hits that you need to drop the target. But it's usually probably 200 for a 1 day, 400 for a 2 day, and maybe 500 for a 3 day. Because on the 3 day, we're going to be doing almost all scenarios, which that doesn't take a lot of rounds for individual scenarios.
Can you, so in order to take your instructor course, do you have to go through all 3 days, or is it one specific course?
No, it's completely separate. This came about, I was up for the second time teaching my, I think, 3 day up at Firearms Academy of Seattle. And if you instruct there, they've got a nice little cabin for you to stay in and go up, meet dinner. In Marty Hayes, then the owner, he's now passed it on. And the second time I taught it up there, we're sitting up there eating dinner, and he says, Ed, you ought to teach an instructor class on this because no one else is doing it. And I thought, yeah, Marty, you're sniffing meth or something, because I don't have the ability to do that. I don't have enough information. And then on the flight home, I flipped up my laptop and I was like, oh, yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. So I did my first one, I think, in 2018. So it's not a certification. I'm not certifying you. It's not one of those classes where if you pass it, you must teach my curriculum. I don't give you curriculum. I give you a copy of all the slides that I show. And what I want you to do is R&D it, which means rip it off and duplicate it. You can take everything I do and copy it, or you can do the buffet method where you say, well, I like this part of it. I like this part of it. I kind of like this part, but I'm going to modify it the way I want to do it. That's fine. Or don't change anything. But it's for instructors that want to do more or start doing active shooter level training, and they want to come learn the lessons I've learned on how I've done it the last 10 or 15 years. So there's no prereq other than you can safely handle a gun and run it on a range. Obviously, I can't have a newbie because it's just going to be unsafe, and they won't. And I've only had issues with church groups and it's only happened a couple of times where after doing a little bit of that assessment in the very first part of the range, I've had to go to the leader and say, hey, you see Ed over here? You seeing what I'm seeing? Yeah, he probably needs to holster his gun. He can stay, he can learn, he can listen, he can help, but he's not doing himself any good. It's only going to hurt his confidence, and it's going to slow down and or make the rest of us unsafe. So I've only had to do that a couple of times, and it went well when I did it. But if everybody's safe, can safely handle a gun, then if they're a low skill level, but Billy Bob is the head of the church security team, then I want Billy Bob to come take this training if he thinks it'll help him train and run his group. So I don't have any prerequisites other than safe gun handling. There's no test. There's no written test. Just I'm going to give you everything that I do, why I do it, the way I do it, the way I used to do it and found out it wasn't that good, or I improved it, where I buy my targets, why I use what targets I do, how, all of my tricks of my trade. Take it and use as much or as little as you want.
Earlier, Ed, you were talking about the active shooter response training that you had seen before you got into teaching and instructing, and you'd mentioned that there wasn't much value in it. What were some of the things that they were teaching in those active shooter response courses that you were like, man, this doesn't really make sense? And how did you overcome that in the instruction that you're providing your students?
Oh, goodness. Well, like I said, the generic one was they would just cover a couple of active shooters. Of course, Columbine would always be one. And then you would just go shoot that. If you arrived late in the day and missed the classroom portion and just did the range, you wouldn't have known it was active shooter. It's just the stuff you do on normal ranges. Especially inside law enforcement, you get the guy who's doing the classroom portion using the slides that 3 cops before him made 12 years ago, and they just kept passing it on to the next guy, and all he knows how to do is flip through the slides, and he doesn't really know what he's talking about. This is what I won't do. So when I do this class, I normally do it with a maximum of 10 students, and that's because once we go to individual scenarios, which I think is the most valuable part of this, what I don't want is what I experienced in one class with one instructor and 12 students was once you got to individual scenarios, you shot a 2-minute scenario and then sat around and BS'd for 45 minutes until it was your turn to go again. I just thought that was a horrible waste of time and money. And I wasn't going to do that. So that's one of the reasons I keep my classes small, so you don't have to wait around much at all. If I have another instructor, I can pretty much keep people going. Airsoft, a lot of people like force on force. I understand it's cool, it's fun. It makes your heart rate get up, but especially with airsoft, and we have airsoft that we use for close in mugging, the parking lot experience, self-defense type shooting. But active shooter, you're very likely to have a longer shot. Well, airsoft starts curving at about the 5 or 7 yard mark, so you could get a hit when the guy didn't actually use good skill, or you get a student that used good skill, but because of the equipment you're using, got a miss. I just thought there were far more negatives than positives. A lot of the co-students with me left the class thinking it was cool because it was fun, but I just thought this isn't really helping the student get better and have confidence at it. Oh my God. So when I moved back here in 2010 to Arkansas, I just started getting into this, and I had a cop buddy say, hey, you're into this active shooter thing. This group, this other agency over here has hired this group to come in and do force on force active shooter training. They're looking for role players. Would you be interested? Well, heck yeah, I'll do that. So I come, and so here's the problem there is the first 3 or 4 or 5 scenarios they do. Now, this is high price stuff. The first several scenarios they do have never, ever happened before. They make up these wild, crazy scenarios of 3 students with guns holding a classroom hostage and all these wild, instead of there's one guy down there with a gun shooting people, go take care of him. Just doing, and basically it was like, this was for law enforcement. You could not win. Every time a student went down there, he got shot and he died. Well, what's that conditioning our officers to do? To not go in the building, because every time they've gone in the building and training, they died. You know, if I sit out behind my car outside the building, I won't die. So I just thought that was horrible. That was the most high-priced training that I was involved with and watched as a role player, and I just thought that was absolutely horrible. But those are just some examples that I saw.
Nice. So I want to get the 2 students involved here, Jeff and Jeremy, but I have one more question for you, Ed. I want to move it over into the psychological aspect of your course. We always like to shoot and have fun and all that stuff, that's the funnest part, right? But when we're talking about something as serious as active shooter training, I looked at a few of your videos on YouTube, and of course you mentioned the late William April. Jeremy and I had the benefit of being able to take his course as well, and there was a lot of really, what's the best word am I trying to say? He gives some scenarios in there that really, really presses your psychological and your psyche on wow, you know, the psychology of a criminal is pretty deep, and we're not them, you know, as William April saying. Yeah. And so let's talk about your course, Ed. Do you get into the psychological aspects of that stuff in the beginning before we go to the range?
Not deeply, only that I will show, depending on the length of the class, I will show things like the chart on Ohio shooter, where in his sentencing hearing, after hearing the victims' families cry about how horrible, you know, the deaths of their kids or the shooting of their kids, how horrible it is, he got to give his own statement in his sentencing hearing, and he looked over at them, you know, still tears in their eyes, and said, "This hand that murdered your sons now masturbates at the memory of it. F all of you." Mm-hmm. And so I don't understand what makes a brain work like that. I don't think it's important to understand what makes it work like that for us responders. We just got to know that exists. And that's what we're going to run into. The San Ysidro McDonald shooter who shot 40 people back in 1984, when he went in, a guy in the booth stood up and said, "Hey, man, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this." And he shot him 14 times. That they are there to carry out their fantasy, and you do not interrupt their fantasy. You don't get to divert their fantasy. And the 14-year-old at Townsville, who was planning on, trying to get a high score of 50, who was going to shoot his way into an elementary school and try to shoot 50 people, just so they understand how evil and bad this is. And that what I tell them, and Jeff will tell I tell them, I say, I asked the sheriff and the chief of police here to give us some inmates, real people for us to shoot at, so this training could be realistic, but they wouldn't give them to me, even though I said I'd let them wear vests. So all I can do is give you first off paper targets and later on plastic mannequins. That's the best I can do. But to get the maximum training out of this, whether you're shooting my paper or my plastic, you got to visualize a shooter. So for the school, Jeff, you got to picture a 16-year-old in your school holding a pump shotgun. That's what you got to picture to get into this. And then I've never been in an active shooter attack in any capacity. I've just studied it and I've tried to war game it. And here's what I honestly believe will happen if I am in one as a responder. I think I will be extremely scared and nervous. And I think it'll be extremely confusing until I find him. Once I find him, I don't think it'll be confusing anymore. I'll still be scared and nervous, but I think a guy holding a gun in a public place shooting at other people will stand out pretty significantly. So I think the confusion at that point will stop. And then I just have to, under that stress, under that fear, apply my skills and put hollow point bullets into him until he's not a problem anymore, and do all that without hurting anybody else. So that's the way I try to set my scenarios up to replicate that, to assess both for me and more importantly for the student, that they assess how well am I able to do that. So it's not only the shooter psychology, more about the students, the responder psychology of, I expect to be under a lot of stress and fear. I expect to always feel like I'm too late because he should have been shot 20 seconds ago. So I'm already behind the time curve. But understanding that, I'm still going to use patience and get within my skill level before I start shooting bullets in a public place. In Jeff's class, there was a law enforcement officer in there, and he said this totally changed what I have been taught in 20-something years of law enforcement, which is get in there and send rounds down range. And he says, you made me understand this is not a range. This is precision shooting. This isn't get in there and do a mag dump in the direction of the bad guy. In the jungles of Vietnam, you can get away with that, but not in a crowded school, a mall, or a church.
I like that. Jeremy, with that, first of all, let me step back. I hope somebody comes up with William April and can do what he did. And I have yet to see someone that is that talented. But what I see, Ed talking about, Jeremy, and maybe you can speak some more to this, for us, the psychology of a criminal, what they're thinking, what their mindset was, why they're doing it at this point, during this situation and scenario, it doesn't matter, right? You hear gunshots, we need to stop this threat to where we can save lives. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And, as I said, that was, when we went into some of the scenario things, as Ed was talking about that, the emotional shooting, when the first few times that you run those scenarios, that's exactly what happened. You see that threat, and as Ed said, he needed to be put down 15 seconds ago. And at that point, you're not worried about, why is this guy doing this or anything else. It's about the safety of everybody that's there. And, and taking out that threat as soon as possible within, your capabilities.
What's something that you wish you knew going into this class, Jeremy, or what's a piece of advice that you have for somebody that's going to be taking this class?
I guess, check your ego at the door. And what I would say about that is, when you're out there all shooting, you're on the range, the tendency to want to look at somebody else's target, how well am I shooting versus somebody else? And at that day, it's not about anybody else. It's about your abilities and making yourself better. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the guy to your left or to your right is performing or not. It's about you and getting yourself better. And that's, being able to slow down, stay within your abilities of, what you're capable of that day. And since that, I've been able to work on some things that I feel, if I was able to go back and repeat the course, I feel like I would be better at than I was the first time. And then, at the end of the day, just trying to make myself better and understanding that it is about me that day and not necessarily everybody else.
Hey, Jeff, I want you to talk a little bit about, we've had you on here previously as an instructor. and as an instructor in this class, what do you think? That's going to be kind of a redundant question. I want to know. So Andy and I were talking about some training that he's gone through and is going through, and a new role that he has at a church, and it kind of plays on what Ed had already spoken to about the active shooter response training that is still in this day. I mean, we look at the Uvalde shooting, and it's those guys had gone through, correct me if I'm wrong, active shooter training prior to that incident, and they still failed to execute. So, Jeff, I wonder, what do you think? Why do you think we still see these critical failures in these high incident or these high profile cases where it's kids literally being shot and the first responders are failing to act? Do you think it's a product of this post-Columbine training? Or is it something else, just a deep psychological fear of, I guess, getting shot?
Well, I think it's two-part, really. I think the training that we've been subjected to for so long. Well, Ed will say it, when he does his presentations or had his class, we've been doing this wrong for over 30 years. And he's right. And our training that we get, at least in public schools, has always been that run, hide, fight. You hear an announcement, you lock the door, somebody comes around and jolts the door, and then they come back over the intercom and say all clear, and you're gone and about your business. So yeah, the type of training is basically irrelevant to the actual event or how to respond to that. And then I think there's also it's always going to happen to somebody else attitude. And we see that every time, especially in my role when I'm presenting to a group of teachers or whoever it might be. You've got those that are locked in and want to pay attention and know what to do if the event happens, and you got the others that want to play on Facebook. And that's sad, but even with the events that we've had with Uvalde, and then again today, and then out in California yesterday or whatever, there's still some, I think Tom Gibbons says in his recent book, everybody expects it to happen to someone else, but to everyone else, you are someone else. And I think there's a lot of that complacency going on, and we forget way too soon. But really, I think what Ed's program does, and the greatest value as far as the training for our district and anyone else who chooses to get that, is he gives you permission to defend yourself and shows you how to do so in a very effective way, that you're not sitting around, you're actually reacting and you're dealing with it, instead of, let's just be honest, getting up on a wall and hoping and praying, right? So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question or not. That's the difference in the two programs. You've got the run, hide, fight. Let's just all call it a drill over the intercom, and that's what we do once or twice a year. Or you can actually have a plan, you can instill that plan, and you can practice that plan to the best of your ability, and give our students, our faculty, our staff, and any visitors on campus options. And that's what Ed teaches: fight, flee, barricade. We have options, and I think that's a glorious thing to have when something like that happens. So yeah, and we choose to fight back. So yeah,
absolutely. I got a listener question, and then I want to kick it to Andy to talk about his situation and what's going on with that. We had Steven ask in the comment section, how important is it? Let me just get to how important is knowing the zero of your handgun for this class? Is that something that's critically important?
Is this to me?
Yeah, we'll kick it off to you, and then Ed or Jeff and Jeremy
that's part of the feedback drill. If we start at the 5-yard line, as Jeff said, shoot a total of 10, but at varying numbers. So we're looking for, are they all in the 8-inch ring? But if they're all grouped together, but off center, then we know we got a problem. So yeah, we got to fix that. And I've only had a problem with that twice, and that's been with red dots that show up that you're in transportation, somehow lost their zero. But yeah, and then as Jeff alluded to, knowing the zero your gun also with your carry ammo. Now, this will really, I think, only affect mostly the better shooters. If you can't shoot past 7 yards, the difference between a 115 grain full metal jacket and a 147 grain plus P is not going to be that big. The biggest the one I remember years ago had a guy that shot all the way back, got 10 out of 10 at 22 through 2 rounds at the 25. So 22 was his distance. And so then we loaded his hollow points, and I do not remember what they were, but his hollow point group actually got bigger than his full metal jacket and moved up and to the right about 8 inches. And so he was like, wow, I never knew that, it shot that differently. Like, that's probably important if that's what you're carrying to shoot people with. So yeah, knowing your zero and then how well you can hit with it. And what I tell them, listen, don't get all upset and embarrassed that you miss. We're all going to miss. Everybody's going to miss eventually if we keep backing up, because that the target area just gets smaller and smaller. So it's not about, haha, I beat you, you beat me, or I'm the best in the class. It's about knowing my capability so I can get in there. If that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Jeff or Jeremy, if you have anything to add to that, we can definitely like to hear that. Otherwise, we'll kick it over to Andy.
Well, I will add, we had one of our school resource officers that was at the class Ed came and did for us, that we found out that day his rear sight was drifted to the left. So Ed ran over and fixed it real quick, and he started getting better hits. So obviously, yeah, that's extremely important, especially with a dot in a situation like that. And I love dots. I have them. I like to shoot dots, but I've actually took the dot off of my carry gun that I had for a little while for this scenario, because I don't have to worry anymore about, like Ed was talking about, something getting happened in transportation or something like that. So, I mean, that's not an anti-dot statement there. It's just that, yeah, I think in this situation, at least in our situation where we're in schools every day, the zero is paramount.
Yeah, ironically, irons need to be zeroed too, right? Wouldn't you agree, Jeremy? You're muted, sir.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. As Jeff said, from that standpoint, accuracy is very, very important when you're looking at other bystanders as well.
Definitely. All right, so I've been kind of waiting to get into this. I've actually lost sleep over this discussion, and kind of to end up this podcast. I really appreciate you guys coming on, but I want everybody just to kind of have a roundhouse and open opportunity here. And Ed, I'm really looking for some advice. I'll be completely honest with you. So I've been going to somewhat, I'll call it a larger church. It's a mega church, quote unquote, here in New Mexico. I won't mention the name, but it's a big church. Finally decided to go ahead and serve, and chose to serve on the security team for obvious reasons. With my background and training, I think that's probably my best fit. And to start it off, I've done a whole one day. So this is part of my being torn in the middle of, I don't want to be that guy that comes in to these security teams and saying, oh man, you guys are doing it all wrong and you need to do it better. And, that's not my goal here. But at the same time, these issues that I'm going to bring up, they're major issues for me. And I'm trying to get through them to try to decide what I want to do. So we have our regular church. The large main church is what we call the main, right? We have the teen kids church, which is on the side. It goes on the same time when the adult church goes on. And then you have your kids area where all the kids go and play, and they're being watched by volunteers. So they've put me into the teen area. That's kind of my spot right now. And immediately I've been told no firearms from the main church. So no firearms are allowed. And I said, what about somebody with training? Well, if anybody, it may be law enforcement. And I said, okay. I said, well, I've got probably a little bit more training than most law enforcement guys do, and I respect law enforcement, respect military, not trying to knock anybody. And then I've got kind of a few answers, and there's a couple guys I think that are watching. I don't want to offend them, but these are real things, and these are super important to me. The chances of something bad happens really small. That's one I heard. Only law enforcement really are authorized to carry. You could, and the other option is you can do a level 3 security guard training, and I'm willing to do that. But what I'm hearing is that takes time for them to get you into that training. Okay, so now I'm part of a 4-team 4-person team for security for teenagers who plays outside in the front of the church before church. They go and spend an hour in church, and then after church they play around in the back, or I'm sorry, in the front area, basketball, music, pool tables, all these things while they wait for parents to get out. And I'm really struggling because I really, really want to serve on the church team, but I'm really struggling with not being able to be armed, because I can go into church, I can sit in the church as a parishioner and be armed, but if my duty is to protect children, I'm not allowed to be armed. And I'm really struggling with this, Ed. So I want to kind of pass it over to you and just let everybody kind of run this conversation and maybe give me some ideas of am I looking at this incorrectly? So give me some ideas, Ed.
Okay, so this is all about time and math. It's all about time and math. Once he starts shooting, he's going to shoot at a certain rate until he decides to stop or we stop him. My goal for every organization, my goal for the country is single-digit victims for all future attacks. And some people say, well, see, why isn't it 0? We should be pushing for 0. That's unrealistic. I would love to have 0, but I have no plan that realistically can get you 0. I've got a plan that has historically got a very good rate of getting single-digit victims. That includes 0, but that's 0 to 9. The only way to have a good expectation of that is to stop the active shooter in the first 30 seconds after his first shot. It's the only way, other than just counting on dumb luck like his gun malfunctioning and him not having another one. The only way, mathematically, to have a good expectation of a single-digit victim count is to stop him in the first 30 seconds. The only way to stop him in the first 30 seconds is for somebody close to him. Generally, I say my definition of being present is you're close enough to see or hear the first shot. Somebody close enough to see or hear the shot, somebody that close to him acting aggressively to counterattack. Now, you can do that with a gun and without a gun. We've seen a couple of recent examples without a gun, and we saw the Indiana Mall with a gun. They can both work. The gun is just so much easier. It's got a better track record because it can be used at a distance. The badge is irrelevant other than, are you legal to have it there? The badge is irrelevant. The 3 things that matter is, are you present, close enough to hear it or see it? And the reason that's magic is, if the person that stops him, is the shooter, is close enough to see or hear the first shot, we do not have to waste time on waiting on a 911 call, a radio dispatch, police travel time, and police entry. And it's all of the time that those things take that let them get a high body count. The 3 magic things are, is the person that's going to stop him present, close enough to hear it or see it? Are they willing? Are they willing to act? All the training and badges in the world are irrelevant if you're not willing. 8 deputies surrounded Parkland School and didn't go in that building. Had over a century of police training, and they all had badges, but none of them were willing to go in the building. Are you present? Are you willing? And are you armed? With those 3 things, when those 3 things coexist, we have a 90% success rate. When those 3 things exist, a good person was present with a gun and was willing to act. 18 out of 20 times, we have single-digit victims. So that's the magic. That's what has a 90% success rate. So what you have to do is have enough good armed people spread out. Now, what's enough depends on the size of the building. But you have to geographically and intelligently spread out your armed people so that it's very likely, no matter where the shooting starts, at least one, preferably 2, at least one of your armed people is close enough to hear it and see it, and therefore can respond and react and stop it very quickly. That's the only way to have an expectation of a low victim count. Civilians are more successful at stopping active shooter attacks early than our law enforcement. Is that because armed civilians are better than cops? No, it's because armed citizens are present and cops aren't. Active shooters are just a subset of violent criminals, and most violent criminals go out of their way to not start their violent criminal act right in front of a uniformed cop. So generally, they won't do it in front of cops. They'll do it in a place they don't think cops exist. But every once in a while, they'll make a mistake and do it where an armed citizen or maybe an off-duty cop is. And armed citizens have a better track record. Armed citizen has never shot the wrong person while responding to and stopping an active shooter. Cops have several times. Cops have shot and killed each other by mistake twice responding to an active shooter, Borderline Bar and Grill in St. George County, Maryland. So again, is that because armed citizens are better? No, I think it's because armed citizens that are present when it starts, it's much less confusing. And it's much easier to stop it quickly than showing up 4, 5, 6, 8 minutes into it and trying to figure out what has gone on and what is going on. So if the church is serious and wants a plan that doesn't hope for, pray for, but actually has a mathematical chance, a good chance at a single-digit victim count should he show up, you need to have good armed people spread out in that manner. Or you can just hope he doesn't show up. And that'll work every day he doesn't show up. Just like not wearing your seatbelt works fine every day you don't get in a collision. But on the day it collides, you're going to want 6 seatbelts on.
Yeah, the saying goes, hope is not a good plan, right?
Yep.
And that's one thing for me is the one thing Jeremy Gill tells us in our class often, right? The chances are really small this happen. It's not the statistic of the chance, it's what's at stake, right?
Yeah, it's catastrophic if it does. Yep.
Right. And one of the other things that I heard from one of the guys was like, well, we don't want you to accidentally shoot one of the kids. And I'm like, compared to the guy with the gun shooting all the kids, like
yeah.
I really struggle with those things. So,
and it's a hypothetical. The armed citizen has never shot the wrong person before, but I call it the hypothetical boogeyman. Well, this might happen. Well, this might happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it might, but what will happen? He will shoot somebody every few seconds if we don't act to stop him. So there's nothing that's risk-free. Everything's a risk. Having cops there with guns has a risk. Exactly 7 days after the Parkland attack, 2 cops inside of schools accidentally negligently discharged their gun. One was in California. I think the other was in North Carolina. Same day, a week after Parkland. So even having cops with guns in any building brings risk. But the thing is, but what's the risk of not having people there with guns? So we have to pick the risk that's best for us.
A lot of people like to make the argument, a couple of the ones that I see getting kind of kicked around is, well, if you're a good guy with a gun, what are you going to, what happens if the cops kick in the door, they see you with a gun and they shoot you? And I'm like, well, chances are if I'm in the room with an active shooter, right, and I pull out my gun and I shoot him, 2 seconds later, the cops kick in the door and shoot me. Had I not been there with my gun, had I not been armed, chances are the bad guy was going to shoot me, right? So the net difference is, well, I saved a few lives and tragically I died, right? But that's the fact that I had my gun doesn't necessarily, or that I didn't have my gun doesn't all of a sudden create a force field and save me, right? Because the boogeyman cops aren't going to kick in the door and shoot me. And the other one is just that, is like, well, what happens if the bad guy is in that classroom and accidentally shoot, or what happens if the teacher accidentally shoots a student if the active shooter comes in, right, and they get into a shootout? And it's like, well, if all the kids are huddled into the corner, right, kids are going to get shot and die and get shot and killed. But it's like you were talking about, what is the risk? What's the true risk of it? And I think removing the good guy with a gun is never a sensible answer. Just one of those things that people like to, I guess, argue about.
Yeah, it's one of the boogeyman arguments, and I in some of my presentations I actually I cover them because I've been getting them for 15 years. The reason it is extremely low risk of the good person with a gun getting shot is because if the good person with a gun is there and stops it in the first 30 seconds, you'll be on your 3rd cigarette by the time the first cop shows up that could accidentally shoot you by mistake. And that's not punking on cops. What do we got to wait on? A 911 call, a radio dispatch, police travel time. Jack Wilson shot that guy 5.5 seconds after he pulled his gun out in White Settlement Church. Jack said at the Faith-Based Security Conference where I talked to him last July, it was 4.5 minutes after he shot that guy that the first cop entered that church. Thurston High School, the kids there actually attacked him unarmed, but they held him for 8 minutes until the first cop shows up. So that's why that hypothetical boogeyman almost never happens, is because it'll be over and done. Well, the recent one in Indiana, Eli Dickens shot that guy within 15 seconds of him starting his attack in the food court mall. Then he went and found the unarmed mall security guy about what he had done. And then that mall security guy walked outside the mall and waited in the parking lot and met the first responding cop. Up until June of 21, I would say it's never, ever, 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 ever happened because of that time delay. Well, then we had Arvada, Colorado. So now it's happened once, but the only reason it happened once is two very rare, unique, wildly crazy things simultaneously occurred. One was cops were already there because the shooter's target was cops. He only wanted to shoot cops, so he made a fake 911 call to bring cops into that public place so that he could shoot them. So that was the first weird, unique, artificial thing where the cops were already there. The second thing was the Good Samaritan, John Hurley, who the shooters put on his, I'm going to kill as many cops as I can. That was his goal. He shot and killed one before John Hurley, an armed citizen nearby, shot and killed him. So he came there to kill as many cops as he could because John Hurley was there and acted. He got one. But then the Good Samaritan made a mistake, which we teach don't do. He picked up the active shooter's rifle and held it to keep it safe. And a cop saw him holding a rifle and shot and killed him. So, yeah, it's happened once, but very wild, unique circumstances. It's a very low chance of happening because it'll be over a long time before the cops get there. And then also, if you're going to be logical, not emotional and political about it, if you honestly believe we can't let armed citizens carry a gun and pull it out an active shooter to end it, then you must also say, logically, I don't want off-duty cops pulling their guns. But nobody will say that. They will all say, well, of course I want an off-duty cop to pull it. And off-duty cops have and saved lives several times, twice in malls alone. So that just shows that it's a political and emotional thing when they say, of course I want off-duty cops to act, but I don't want the citizen without a badge to act, even though they're both people legally carrying guns in a public place in civilian clothes.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to kick it over to you, Jeremy Reese. Principal at a school, right? And that, I'm not asking you to give the exact details of your school, whether you're armed or not armed, because sometimes that's, political and you can't talk about that. But give me some advice there as a principal, somebody who's got some education background and who's been in firearms and now have done active training. What are your thoughts on the?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that Ed stresses in his class, it's all about time. And, and any time we do drills at school, whether that's a fire drill, a tornado drill, any of those type of scenarios, it's all based on time. How fast were you able to evacuate the building? We look at all kind of different safety things from doors and exterior doors, entry points, and all those types of things. And yes, we do have a school resource officer, but we're a pretty large campus, and if that armed person is on the other end of campus, the time that it would take to for him to get to another part of that building, or as allude to the time for a 911 dispatch call and other people to arrive. As Ed points out in his class, for every minute, that's more casualties that that bad guy's racking up. So to be able to eliminate that threat as soon as possible, I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, moving into, I watched a few videos of Ed's courses. And one of the things that you mentioned in a few of the YouTube videos was every 10 seconds by average, someone gets shot. And all of us are here smart enough to do the math. If we have to wait on somebody to respond on that side of the church, whether it's 1 minute or 2 minutes, we all can do the math of how that number goes up dramatically. And yeah, I'm going to say it again, being a soft target of someone who has this training, I look at it in multiple different facets, right? I do the right thing and I go serve and I do the best I can do unarmed. But what if that day comes and I am in there and I am unarmed, knowing that I had the ability to defend somebody and I couldn't, right? Or I do the other option, right? What's my other option? Use my tactical tennis shoes and get the hell out of there, right? And leave every kid behind, knowing that I'm going to go home and I'm not going to be able to sleep at that night, knowing with my training that I could have had the opportunity to defend somebody and I chose to run. Right. And I think that's an okay answer as well. Wouldn't you agree, Jeff?
Yeah. I mean, you're in a no-win situation when you're not allowed to do what you could do to help the situation. That's pretty simple. And going back to, I believe, the question Gil asked about it comes down to probability versus possibility. Yeah, you could shoot a kid. Sure, that's a possibility. What's the probability of that? The probability of one of my armed staff members dropping a gun and it going off is virtually zero. The possibility is there. But I think some of those arguments, like Ed said, he addresses them, does that very well in his course, to demystify some of these arguments that people that are untrained and unfamiliar with what we're doing, they just don't realize how unlikely something like that really is. And yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. And thankfully, where I'm at, we had people that made a decision that they're tired of this and seeing it every so often on the news. And if that day ever comes for us, we want to be able to do something about it, because the probability of us being able to act and save lives is much higher than the possibility of running and hiding in the corner saving lives. And I think that's what it comes down to, the way you have to look at it. So to your point, yeah, you're just in a no-win situation, and it's tough, when you have that skill set and you're handcuffed.
Yeah. Again, we're called to serve in church, right? And this is something that I've really wanted to do for a long time. Been going to this church for 10 plus years. My mother-in-law serves. My wife, she's working on serving. She's actually going to do something here in February soon. And it was really a calling to me. And like I said, I started this off with, I've lost sleep over this. And I'm really struggling on what the right answer is, because I really love my church. I really want to serve, but I just really struggle with what the right answer is. So I'll spin it all the way back to you, Ed, and then Jeremy Gill can take over. I guess I'm going to put you in the hot seat, eh? If you were in my shoes, what would you do?
I would continue to do everything above board in the right way, and then I would make a decision in the dark by myself on what I wanted to do based off risk assessment. And I don't know what your situation is, but I can tell you I've run into churches and I've run into armed school staff, because Arkansas, you can have armed school staff if you go through a bureaucratic hula hoop. In not all, but in several armed church staff and armed school staffs that I've trained, it's a good old boys network. It's a social club. It's like, we don't want anybody else. It's just us 5, us 6, and we're the ones that can be armed, and we're special. And they don't think through, we have to have enough and we have to have them placed. And you're not qualified, or you haven't gone through some kind of special training, is just, in a lot of times, a way they don't grow the social club, because they don't want more people in there. Instead of saying, we want to protect the flock, we know we have to stop him in the first 30 seconds. We know we need minimum this many people in this locations to do it. It's making adult, realistic decisions versus, well, it probably won't happen here, so we won't do it decisions. That's just like the school who has 6 buildings and they've got one SRO, one cop on the campus with 6 buildings, and they think because that cop's here, his or her badge and uniform is a force field that will magically protect us. And not like time and math, like, well, Columbine had an SRO, like Parkland had an SRO, Santa Fe had 2 SROs, Pulse nightclub had an armed security, an armed cop there in uniform, and it still doesn't prevent the attack, and it didn't keep low numbers. It's all about math and time. Yeah, I would attempt to approach it logically, but some people won't deal with that. Then you just got to make a decision, and that's an individual decision.
And Ed, about Pulse, I was actually asked about that today. Will you talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's relevant to the point you just made. That was his, third choice on the list?
Well, it wasn't. Yeah, it was his second audible. His main goal was Disney World, and then he saw too much armed security there, so he Googled nightclubs in Orlando. He went to the first result Google gave him, that he saw an armed cop there, so he left there and went to the next one, which happened to be Pulse, which had an armed cop, but he didn't see the cop's car, and the cop had stepped outside of the club, and he didn't see him, so that's why he went in there.
Point made. I mean, he went where the path of least resistance.
And I wasn't there, but I would bet some amount of my income that the people walking into the club that night that saw a uniformed cop at the entrance or wherever he was probably thought, thank goodness this club pays to keep us safe. We got a cop here, so we're safe. Well, it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, not so much. I think Jeremy Gill can talk about that. He went to Disneyland or Disney World a couple of years ago, and we kind of discussed that, about kind of how easy it was for him to walk in if he wanted to. But let me ask you real quick, Ed, do you do private courses? You do, right? Do you travel?
I travel, but most of my travel is just consulting and education presentations, because the live fire that I like to do that's the most valuable involves these 3D mannequin targets. And I generally haven't done that beyond a day's drive. So where Jeff is, that was 4 or 5 hours. I've gone to Oklahoma City Gun Club down in the Dallas area. The only time I've gone beyond a day's drive, because I have to pile these targets in my vehicle and take them with me, is a large church and private school in Arizona. They bought the targets because they said, after you leave, we're gonna keep training this. And then Firearms Academy of Seattle up in Washington State, they bought the targets. So now every time I go up there, they have the targets. So I've been traveling nationwide nonstop with Uvalde, but most of that has been educational presentations, followed up by consulting, going through and talking to them about how to train their staff, how to do walkthroughs, how to improve everybody's ability to make the best choice for them individually on fight, flee, barricade, and then pre-positioning tools to execute any of those three.
Have you considered doing your seminar online?
I've done up to 1 hour presentations online several times. Each time I think it's been the broad study where I touch on everything. I also have a school focused presentation. I have law enforcement lesson learned focused presentation. I have a church focused presentation, but I've done the presentations online a few times. The most recent one, I believe, was for Iowa Gun Owners Coalition, which was several months ago. But I always caution, anytime I do anything online, I truly believe what I presented was accurate on that day, but every time things happen after it was recorded, of course, the information could be old.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I went to Disney a few years ago when our second kiddo was young, and it was there were some things, and I was like, man, there's, if I was a bad guy and I'd come through here a couple times, I had just picked up a couple gaps, or what I perceived to be gaps in security, right? Like everybody walks through metal detectors except for the stroller. And they weren't looking under the stroller. And I'm like, well, that's kind of a soft deal. And then we went back a couple years later, and it looked like the security had been stepped up. And here in Albuquerque, we do the balloon fiesta, and it was kind of the same deal. I was like, man, there's really not much to stop somebody from coming in here and doing a bad thing. And I was talking to one of my buddies who's in law enforcement. And he said, yeah, that's there's a heavier plainclothes officer presence at that event than any other event around the country, and it's one of the largest aviation events. I was like, well, all right, well, that's reassuring. I'm sure they have some more security in the background that isn't overt, but yeah, it was kind of that first time I went to Disney as a parent after being kind of in this world for a while. I was like, it's not really. There were a couple gaps that I had seen. I'm sure they had shorted up since then. Let me see. Let me go through the comments real quick. Man, this was a great episode. The first couple minutes in, I was like, man, I'm really glad that we got to do this, because it's unfortunately, it sounds like you've been super busy, Ed, which is good to hear, because I feel like, when an event happens, that's when everybody runs out to get the training. Everybody's like, oh, we got to do this. We have to do this. And then it kind of tapers off. And then we kind of get lulled into a false sense of security. And I, with my own, if I'm looking at the training that I want to do this year and next year, admittedly, active shooter training wasn't on that list just because it was, it's not top of mind. But within like the first 2 or 3 minutes of hearing you talk, I was like, man, this is something that I have to get into and do. And it was really when you were talking about how you're taking a practical approach to the active shooter response training, and really digging into what the problem is, addressing the problem head on, and hey, these are the solutions, right? And the fact that, we're not going to get it to, we would love to get it to where, an active shooter shows up and there's 0 victims, but that's not realistic. So before we end up, I want to kick it around the horn to you guys. Ed, I want any parting advice that you have for our listeners, anything that you want to touch on. And then if somebody wants to receive if somebody wants to take a class with you, where should they go to find out more information?
You can email me at my name, edmonk, EDMONK, at AOL.com. Yeah, I'm still with AOL. My cell number is 870-273-1113. We don't have a website. We have a Facebook page, Last Resort Firearms Training. We're pretty low key. Call, text, or email if you think I can help you. We've touched on accuracy, and some of the criticism I get from other gun people, other instructors, is several say, 100% is unreasonable, and I don't think it is. And again, it's where are you 100%? We're all 100% at 1 foot from the target, so we just have to figure out how far back we can get 100%. And so what I would say is, if your 6-year-old daughter is inside the middle of a crowded church sanctuary on Sunday, and the active shooter comes in there, and a responder comes in to take care of the active shooter, whether it's a cop or a citizen, I don't care, and your daughter is in the middle of that sanctuary, do you want that responder to be 100% accurate, or 80%, or what percentage do you want him to be accurate? So I think we got to start making our range training like we want our street stuff to do. So one cop, I'll steal it from this one cop. He said, so you're saying we got to bring the street to the range, not the range to the street. And that's exactly right. So my saying is, we talk Rule 4, we don't train Rule 4. About any gun class, you have to, what are the gun safety rules? Be sure of your target and what's in line with your target. You have to know the rule. And then what do? We take you out to a sterile, unrealistic range where there's a big dirt wall behind the target. And whether or not you hit or miss this paper cardboard target, there's a dirt wall behind it, so everybody's safe. And the range master doesn't let anybody out in front of you while you're shooting, God forbid. And there's nothing except your target and a dirt wall. Well, that's not what an active shooter is. It's not what any public shooting is. But it's certain active shooters, by definition, they're going to go to a crowded place. So this has to be a precision thing. We have to demand 100% accuracy, and we have to expect 100% accuracy, so that we get the bad guy without causing more casualties. And then the last thing is, one of the things I show the students is, whether it's an open enrollment class or a specific group like a school or a church, or I'm talking to cops, is, with rare exception, these active shooters that we're training to go deal with, they're not Jason Bourne, they're not John Wick, they're not Chuck Norris, they're not a supernatural being, they're not a Navy SEAL. 95% of them are punks that brought dad's gun to school or to the mall or to the church. So yeah, they're dangerous, but they're not that tough of an opponent to go up against. So yeah, it's going to be scary. Yeah, you can get hurt, but this is not that tough of an opponent to go up against. So get in there and apply your skill.
Yeah,
and then one last thing, I'm all about training, but I think in the training industry, if you haven't trained as much as I have, with as many contact hours as I have, with the instructors that I pre-approve, then you're sure to die in every gunfight you ever get into. I think we get a little too much of that. I'm all about training. I think it can help with confidence. I think it can help with ability. The better we have confidence in our ability, the more likely I think we are to go in and fight this guy. But we just had a 22-year-old guy starting at 42 yards, stop a guy in a mall with no professional gun training whatsoever. So the biggest thing is, are you there and are you willing? Those are the two biggest things. Training is important, but it's not an absolute got-to thing.
Yeah, it's funny because those same instructors, in the same breath, they'll tell you that accuracy isn't important. Defensive accuracy is good enough. And they hide behind that because they can't teach people how to shoot. And why wouldn't you want somebody to have the ability to be 100% accurate on their best day, right? You will never be as good in an active shooter situation. It's never going to be as easy as the most stressful range session that you've ever been at, right? So why would we not have that? And you have to know, right? Like the fact that you're requiring students, like, hey, this is whether it's 3 yards, 7 yards, 15 yards, 20 yards, the number is irrelevant. What's relevant is and you understand what your skill set is, so that you do not place other people in an unnecessary danger because of your lack of knowledge, right?
Exactly.
So that's huge. I think we had a comment pop up here. Jeremy, let's kick it over to you. What advice do you have for folks, and anything else that you would like to talk about or touch on before we jump off of here?
Well, I mean, I think if anybody gets an opportunity to take one of Ed's classes, I would highly recommend it. One of the things that he does is it doesn't matter what skill level you bring to the table that day, whether it's somebody like me who's kind of been in it 5-6 years to, we had some police that were in that course that had been doing it for 30 years. Ed presents it in a way that it's specifically directed to you and how to better yourself. And at the end of the day, that's what I wanted was to make myself better, to prepare myself, whether it's in a school setting, in a mall, in a church, wherever it is, that I knew how to handle myself and to feel that I was proficient to handle a situation if it arose.
Awesome. Jeff, over to you, brother. What advice and parting thoughts do you have for our folks?
Yeah, I'll echo Jeremy. Yeah, if you get a chance to go see Ed, I think it's great. Even if you're not involved in school, church, security, we've mentioned Dickinson at the mall multiple times. It could happen anywhere. It's a great skill, and there's skills that transfer, I think, to various situations really well. And if I can make a comment unrelated to active shooters real quick. We recently had a lady that suffered an attack here in our local area, and her statement was, I had my mace, but I didn't see him coming. I couldn't get it out in time. So a local entity has bought her a gun and taught her how to shoot. That's not going to do you any good if you have no conflict avoidance and situational awareness. So please don't neglect those things, people. I just had to get that out because, it might buy some goodwill and sell some guns, to do that for somebody, but it's not saving a life when you don't know it's there. So situational awareness, conflict avoidance, the gun's not magic. Just that's on my heart tonight because of that. So, yeah.
Gonna get the mace out. What makes you think you'd be able to get the gun out?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, Andy, over to you, brother.
Man, this was a good podcast. Glad on with our jobs and our other obligations. Sometimes it takes us a bit to get back on, but this was a really good one to get back on. And it was, somebody might sit in the audience and say, "Oh man, this almost sounds set up with Andy's situation and Ed Monk coming on," but it really wasn't. I think it was just put in place perfectly. So Ed, I agree with Jeremy. I think you've bumped up to been to the top of the list on our training kind of bucket list. I'm going to see you soon at some point. I don't know when that's going to be. Jeremy, thanks for coming on. We appreciate you coming in as an educator and doing what you do, and just even having the mindset of trying to think about these things, because we know in this world that's not very common in most places. We're out here in New Mexico, we're majority blue, so that's almost something that doesn't even get talked about unless it's in a negative light. So Jeff, it was a pleasure having you back on again. We actually need to get you on as an instructor, so we need to talk about that on a sidebar. But yeah, I think everybody needs to go and see Ed. And if you can't see Ed, get on the YouTubes and find Ed Monk, look at what he's teaching and what he's learning, and get some sort of training. I think some sort of training is important, whether it's concealed carry and trying to just start from somewhere. I think that's a very important thing to do. I like the idea of just, instead of going out on the range and just kind of square range paper targets, to where it looks like to me, Ed really makes you use this thing up here that's more important than just about any other weapon. Because if you don't have this, you don't have the mindset, you don't have the thought process. Just like Jeff said, you can have mace, you can have a bazooka, none of that crap matters if you don't have any kind of mindset of how am I going to put all this together. So I really like all that. So I appreciate all of you coming on. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, this is a great episode. Really can't thank you guys enough. Jeff, I appreciate you reaching out to Ed, and Ed, I appreciate you coming on and bringing Jeremy on to provide his insight as a student. I think we could have easily have gone on another couple hours for this, and I know I say that on quite a few episodes, but I definitely do want to give you guys the rest of your evenings back. I believe you're at least an hour or so ahead of us. And for everybody out there, remember, it's your life, it's your safety and protection, it's your responsibility. You guys stay safe, and we'll see you next time.